Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Process Podcast. Katrina Rozga, welcome to the Process Podcast.
Thank you.
I'm going to try and give a bit of an introduction of yourself, Katrina. If I miss anything, you fill in the blanks. You are the director of therapy and counselling at the Blurton Family Development Centre. Particular areas of interest: cognitive behavioural therapy, positive psychology, and solution-focused therapy. You are Canadian, who's currently over in the UK, escaping in an intelligent escape of the madness of Hong Kong right now. Fill in the blanks. What did I miss?
Absolutely nothing, really, besides the fact that I recently have started diving into something called Emdr Therapy as well. I don't know if you've heard of it. Super interesting stuff if you haven't. It is used often for trauma, but can actually be used in a lot of other areas. And I work a lot with obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, as well. But yeah, so EMDR, if you haven't heard of it, I know you guys are, you and your listeners are into health and wellness. It's a really, really interesting therapy.
Could you break that down? What does EMDR stand for, Kat?
Eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. So pretty much what would be a good way to describe it? When something happens to us, it can be something, a big trauma, right? Something such as an assault, a car accident, or it could be a more minor, smaller trauma. Trauma is trauma, of course, and whatever you think is traumatic is for you to decide, but more so in the sense that something like a dog bite, something, causes fear. The way that it gets stored into our memory can cause it to kind of keep coming back and influencing us. It keeps having an emotional response, or causing an emotional response to us. It's not put away in our memory like other memories. So EMDR is something where you use eye movements, so side to side, bilateral eye movements, in order to help your brain to process those traumatic events and put them away more like a regular memory. So they no longer bring up all those emotional responses in you. It's thought to be similar to what happens when we're asleep, when you're in REM sleep. If you've ever seen someone dreaming, their eyes move back and forth. So the thought is that is allowing our brain to process whatever's happened to us throughout the day. So we recreate that type of movement in order to help while holding whatever memory it is that we are trying to process in our mind, in order to allow us to put it away in a more regular fashion, as opposed to the way that it's held in our brain and continuing to cause emotional responses.
Awesome. You just reminded me. Have you watched? There is, I think it's on Netflix. It's called Heal, and
No.
they use basically take a group of people who've had some have had traumatic experiences. Some are dealing with, different bouts of cancer in different stages of it. And they basically go about with a much more holistic approach to curing and fixing. There's been other people who have like broken spines, injuries where they said, you're never going to get back to do anything. And actually one of the protocols that one of the therapists uses is EMDR. Now that you talk about it, I can very clearly picture the process and the therapy that they were doing, but didn't know about it at the time, but super interesting. We have lots of stuff really we want to get into and talk about and dig into all these crazy things and cool things that you do. But the first question I want to ask you, is there a story or is there a reason as to why you ended up becoming a therapist or a counselor?
Oh, 100%. It's funny because I think any psychologist, counselor, therapist that you speak to will probably have something in their past that caused them to go down this route. For me, it's from my childhood. So I was an incredibly anxious child. I mean, it's funny because looking back now, I can see exactly what was going on and why I was, feeling the way I was feeling. But I had high levels of anxiety. I was an insomniac because of it. I didn't sleep. I was so anxious that it actually tended to revolve around my mom and fear around something bad happening to her. It would me all day. I would be really, really worried about her leaving the house. I would freak out if I had to leave somewhere without her. If she called and left a message on the answering machine, I would cry because I would worry that it would be the last time that I would talk to her and I'd missed her call. I mean, like, I was crazy anxious. So much so that it led to a lot of OCD-like behaviors. I started having rituals and things I had to do before she left the house to sort of calm my nerves and feel, safe in thinking that I had done everything in my power to keep her safe. So it was just such an awful, awful experience, being young and being, not understanding why I was feeling the way I was feeling. That what eventually, when I did go to therapy and sort of sorted myself out and got help, the help that I really desperately needed, and felt better, I think it just put me on track to feeling, the need to ensure I could help other people who were experiencing similar things or other things that needed that kind of help.
If you don't mind sharing, I assume there was a something that happened in your life to create that concern or that fear and that anxiety about your mum. Was it, if you don't feel comfortable sharing, of course, that's absolutely fine. But, would you shed some light on maybe what that thing was?
I don't think there was anything that really happened. I'm just a highly anxious person. Anxiety runs in my family. So I'm not the only one. There is a genetic component, as there is for a lot of mental health issues. We say that there's always a genetic component, or most likely. Doesn't mean that it will cause you to develop whatever it is that, is running in your family, but it puts you, predisposes you to it. But for sure, I think I was just born anxious. My mom says that she used to worry heavily about what kind of adult I would grow up to be, because I was such an anxious child and struggled so heavily with just day-to-day tasks. Lucky for her, it all ended up fine.
Here you are. What was the point which led you to actually seeking therapy yourself?
I think I got old enough when I was about, a teenager, like late teens, to recognize that I needed help, and that there was help available out there, right? Because obviously when you're young, you don't really know about psychology or therapists or what you can do. Maybe kids nowadays might have more access to that with the internet, but obviously the internet wasn't around when I was a kid. So you may not be able to, advocate for yourself in the same way that you could now. But I had no idea until I got older. And then I think in high school, seeing friends go through depression and anxiety and having the school recommend that they go and seek help kind of opened my eyes to the fact that this is something that was available.
And what was that actual process like for you? Like how long did it last? At what point do you feel that, okay, I can start to step away from this and I have the tools or the awareness to start taking things into my own hands?
Well, I think the thing with therapy is, I think it's something you can kind of keep going back to, whenever you need. I would say initially I did some individual and then some group therapy, probably for a year on and off. I had originally gone to the doctor and they tried to give me medication right off the bat, but I didn't really want to just go straight to medication. They didn't even recommend that I go and see a therapist or anything. They just wanted to give me anti-anxiety medication, which, my mom was fine with me taking if I wanted it, etc., but I didn't want it. So I then chose to go to therapy instead. I actually also got acupuncture, which was really helpful. It was one of the most helpful things that I did, was actually acupuncture. And this is not to say that I'm anti-medication. I'm not at all anti-medication when it comes to mental health issues. But I think medication, one, has a place, but also should be combined with therapy. It's not, a treatment in and of itself for most mental health illnesses, because you need to learn how to cope as well on top of taking medication. But I personally just didn't want to. I did eventually take some medication, but at the time I wanted to try therapy. So yeah, it was on and off. And then I went back for a little bit when I was in university. I did therapy a couple of years ago for 16 sessions, because it was actually required for my doctorate, which was quite nice. I was actually pretty excited to be told I have to go to therapy to be on the receiving end to graduate from my doctorate. because I just always find it so helpful to go and refresh and get more insight from someone different on what I can do. As much as I know what I should be doing or what I would tell other people, it's something else to be on the receiving end and actually have somebody, guiding you instead of you trying to guide yourself.
That's cool how you talk about, a part of your doctorate, you actually had to do therapy and you're excited for it. I feel like there is a stigma and a dogma around therapy where it's something that's only needed when things are really, really, really bad. But I know certainly in recent times, I think that stigma is starting to slowly shift. Like who is actually a candidate for therapy? Maybe where has a stigma of it being something for people who just really need help and are in a bad place come from?
In my opinion, every single person is a candidate for therapy. I don't think that there is anyone in the world that could not benefit in some way, because it isn't just about, helping someone who has some sort of, clinically diagnosable mental illness. You can go to therapy to improve your outlook on life, to help you make decisions, to give you skills to cope with specific issues if you have them, or to help you in a relationship. Maybe you want to learn to communicate better. There are so many ways that therapy can help. You can do coaching just around, becoming sort of the best version of yourself, or the happiest, or addressing anything that's holding you back in life. There is absolutely no one in the world that I think couldn't go to therapy and actually find something that they could use.
I mean, I think most people listening would think, yeah, that kind of makes sense. But I think there's probably a lot of people listening as well who maybe not in our listeners, but thinking more about the general population of the world, who perhaps don't even have the awareness to even think that there is another way of being or another way of living life. What are your thoughts?
Oh, 100%. I mean, even in my job, I have access to people who come to therapy because they want to, right? Because they see something in their lives that they would like to change, or they have some kind of skill they'd like to learn. But I also see the people on the other end who are there because someone else is forcing them to, and they don't see the purpose, and they don't see anything that they could gain from it. And those people, well, I work with a lot of teenagers, so I see a lot of resistance. But it's quite funny because I feel like 90% of the time people come around to it and realize that it's not the way they're imagining it. I'm not a 60-year-old man who's going to make you lay on a couch and tell me about your relationship with your mother, right? That's not the kind of therapist that I am. But I feel like a lot of people imagine that it's going to be that. If you don't want to talk about your past, we don't have to. I'm there as the individual who is going to help you figure out whatever it is you want to figure out. And if there's things you don't want to access, you don't want to talk about, you don't want to address, that's fine. It's entirely up to you. You are the one who is leading what we do and what we talk about, not me. So I think that some people have a fear of accessing areas of their life that they don't really want to, or they feel like it means something about them, something negative, right? I'm in therapy, there's something wrong with me. And I just think that we need to really lose that perspective, because that's definitely not the case.
Something I always think about when I think about if I'd end up being a therapist is surely there is a lot of, because essentially people often are, and as part of your job, are unloading a lot of trauma and what a lot of people would probably seem to be like burdens. And that's probably like a big part of your everyday. Like, how do you not let that manifest itself in your own life? How do you create that separation?
So it's funny because my master's, when I did my master's, part of my program was learning to cope as a psychologist, learning skills so that you can keep some sort of separation between work life and your regular day-to-day life, so you don't really let it seep in. And I would say that first and foremost, you have to have a separation between work and home. So I don't give clients my personal number, for example. I only work between certain times. I try not to check my email outside of office hours, although I still do. But if it's not an emergency, I let everyone know I won't be responding unless I'm in working hours. I have friends, who are therapists who don't put in those boundaries, and I feel like they struggle more because they feel like they have to, answer. Or if someone is in distress and they message you in the middle of the night, you're going to feel the need to answer. But I think that it's important to set your clients up with access to what they should do and where they should reach out if it's outside of regular hours, so that you feel like they're safe. But then you also have to put a separation so you're not feeling responsible for them 24 hours a day. On top of that, it's a lot of practice in how you listen, I would say. So the way that I listen to clients is different to how I would listen to a friend, right? If a friend is telling me about a problem that they're having, I'm listening as a friend. I'm being there to support them, and I'm sort of, taking in what they're saying personally because they're a friend of mine. Whereas if I'm with a client, I am there to put into place as many things as I can to help them. So when I listen, I'm constantly thinking about the next question or what I need to figure out, or what should we be doing? What types of skills does this person need? How should we proceed? So I'm not listening on the same, I guess, emotional level as I would with a friend, because we're time limited and I want to do my best to help that person in the time that we have. So I'm just constantly trying to work out what the next step is. And I feel like that provides a sense of protection for me as well, maybe. And then it's just practice over time. When I first started, I really struggled. You can ask my husband. Fridays were always the worst because I was working at a school, and Fridays at this school, it was notorious. The vice principal and I used to talk about this all the time. Someone would come into my office and say, have their session. And then at the very end would be leaving and would say, drop a bomb, right? They would say like, okay, and I want to kill myself, bye. Or, my dad is abusing me, bye. And they would run out the door, and I would have to, catch them and get the vice principal, do the reporting and everything, and figure out how to keep them safe. And it was always on a Friday. It was always because I guess their thinking was, I'll have the whole weekend. But really, we would have to deal with it immediately and ensure they were safe. But I would come home on Fridays and just look at my husband and be like, I do not want to talk. I just want some quiet time. Let's go get a drink. Let's go get dinner.
I mean, the advice on boundaries is super important. I think, as, for us as coaches as well, so many times we end up wearing unintentionally a bunch of different hats. And, your relationship, when you form a strong relationship with an individual, it does often mean that the relationship still continues outside of the workplace or the training place. But I do think setting up those clear boundaries is a really, really important thing. And also very interesting to hear about the concept of like addressing something then and there as well, because I think, as this has happened as a friend, it's happened as a coach, it's happened in many different hats in my life. But, when you open yourself up to be there for someone, you also need to be really patient sometimes, because as you said, sometimes people just aren't ready to speak. And I imagine in your role, you've got, like you said, you're bound by time. You've got an hour with someone, and you probably just have to sit there and probably be one of the most patient people ever to allow this person to get to a point where they feel like they can share, where you can even start to intervene in some way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think especially working with teenagers, that one is very important, the patience, because you'll have teenagers come in who obviously, there's a difference with working with adults, because a lot of the time, if an adult is coming in to see me, it's of their own choosing. They want to seek help. They are ready to work. They're ready to get what they came for. Whereas a teenager comes in because their parents forced them to, most likely. And they sometimes will literally sit there for the entire hour completely silent and will refuse to speak. And one of the things that I remember being taught in my training was you have to become very comfortable with silence, because you will have moments where you have to spend an entire hour with someone who refuses to speak to you. And if you've ever been in a situation like that, people become very uncomfortable very quickly with silence. So you have to learn to get over it. So I'm now incredibly comfortable with silence. You could be staring at me saying nothing for, as long as you want, and it will not even faze me. Sometimes with that situation, I just end up talking at the person. I'll just tell them about things, or, knowing what they came in for, I might just start giving them ideas of things that they could do, because eventually some of it goes in, right? They're listening to what you're saying. They may not be thinking that you're right, or they may not be responding, but I'll just keep talking at them. Or sometimes I'll say, that's fine. I'll sit in silence with you if that's what you need. What ends up happening is that eventually either they start responding, or you change the subject, get them to talk about something else and then lead back. Or if you're silent, a lot of people feel the need to fill silence. So if I'm silent, the other person will eventually usually start talking, because they're not as comfortable with silence as I am.
I mean, I think that was the latter is definitely me. I mean, like, I can think back to so many times as a coach and as a friend where silence was actually needed, but I always felt the need to fill silence. I even felt that, in an hour of coaching, that silence in the hour was not a return on investment on what my client's paying for. That I definitely think in recent times it's something I've become a lot more comfortable with. And I think certainly, like, as I've maybe become a person where people feel a little bit more comfortable opening up to, there are sometimes really, really, really long bouts of silence that I kind of laugh to myself to be like, I'm really proud that I can actually handle this silence now, because it's something I really, really used to struggle with.
Yeah, a lot of people do.
Tell me about the concept of circles of control. Actually, before we go into that, I kind of want to just to understand for myself, because I don't have a very clear definition of the differences here, but the difference between cognitive behavioral therapy, positive psychology, and solution-focused therapy. You talked to us about EMDR already, and you touched on, working with people with OCD, but what are the differences in those different types of psychology?
So, I mean, just like there are, a ton of different people doing psychology, with that come all different sorts of approaches. I would say that most psychologists will come from, a sort of a mixed bag, where they'll have ones that they really, really like, and sort of try and tailor their approach to the client. Same for me. So, I mean, CBT for me, cognitive behavioral therapy, is sort of that baseline, right? I feel like it is a really important bottom level to anything else that you do, because it focuses on the way that you're thinking and what you're doing, and how that influences the way that you think or the way that you feel, as well as what you're experiencing in your body. For example, like physical sensations like anxiety. And most people don't question the way that their thoughts impact how they feel, right? They just sort of assume that because it's in their head, it's accurate and true, but that is completely false, right? I mean, we have a lot of really weird thoughts throughout the day. We think about all sorts of different things. The problem is that sometimes those thoughts get stuck, and we can't get past them. It's almost like our brain shines a spotlight on specific thoughts, especially anxiety-inducing or depressive thoughts. And so we believe them, and then they become, more true to us. They come back more often, and then, you can sort of spiral, and that can influence how you feel. It can influence what you do. But because we can't change how we feel, directly, so you can't snap your fingers and say, I'm going to be happy, and make yourself happy. You can, however, change what you think, and you can change what you do, and therefore impact how you feel. And that's what CBT focuses on. So you want to work on metacognition, which is thinking about thinking, which not everyone does, right? No, most people don't question their thoughts and don't think about thinking, but you really need to if you want to try and influence how you feel. I always tell people that you should treat your thoughts kind of like a random dude on the street just shouting at you, right? You wouldn't believe everything this person is saying. You'd be like, what the hell is this person talking about? You want to do the same thing with your thoughts.
So what the concept of thinking about your thinking, what does that look like?
So rather than just, saying something to yourself and assuming it's true, you question it. So for example, one thing that I do a lot, so this comes to this idea of, you and I had talked a little bit before about unhelpful thinking styles, right? So we have these unhelpful ways that we think. Everyone does it, but some people do certain ones more often than not. For example, one grouping is called jumping to conclusions. which includes mind reading and fortune telling. So thinking that you know what other people are thinking. So especially if you feel like someone is judging you or thinking negatively about you, or fortune telling, like you can predict the future, right? Oh God, I'm going to fail that test, or I'm going to bomb at this meeting, this presentation I have to do. It's going to be awful. And if that's what you're thinking, you're going to spiral and you're going to make yourself worse. You're going to make yourself feel really anxious. And then the likelihood that you will not do well gets higher because of the way that you're thinking about it. So you need to stop and ask yourself, how accurate is this thought? Do I know what this person's thinking? Have they ever said anything to me to make me think that that's what they think? What is the evidence here? And usually you'll come back to yourself and say, oh, there's actually no evidence. I'm basing this on nothing. It's actually just me judging myself. And you can, realize that your thinking is inaccurate. An example I like to use is, let's say you were walking down the street, you see someone and they wave at you, or no, you wave at them and they don't wave back, right? You see them, you wave at them, they don't wave back. You have some options of how you're going to take that and what you're going to think about it. So you might say to yourself, like, oh, what a jerk, what an asshole. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, sorry.
Yeah, swear away.
Okay. How dare they? I can't believe that they wouldn't wave back. Like, that's so rude. And you might walk away angry, and that will change how you behave towards that person. You might send them an angry text or ignore them. Or you might think to yourself, oh, why are they ignoring me? Did I do something? Oh, I must have said something wrong the last time I saw them. I must have, made them upset with me. And then all of a sudden you might be anxious, you might be upset. And then you might avoid that person for fear that you've done something wrong. Or you might think to yourself, oh, maybe they didn't see me. And then there's nothing, it's just neutral, right? And you go on your day. But the way that you think about that situation will influence how you feel and how you behave. And there's so many different ways that it can go, and it's all based on your thinking.
What are some of the strategies that you recommend people? I mean, like, I think so much of understanding the mind is almost like it requires training and practice, in the same way that we go to the gym and we train to get fitter or build muscles. Like, what are some of the protocols because I mean, those are some examples that I'm sure all of us can relate to. So how does one even go about trying to not jump to conclusions, or not try to predict the future and get too attached to those thoughts?
Yes, definitely requires time and training. So the thing with CBT is, if you go and see a therapist, it actually requires homework, right? There's very little that we can really get done in the hour that I see. So what we do is, usually you will learn about the unhelpful thinking styles. We'll review what you're thinking, perhaps. We'll talk about what's going on, and then you will be given homework to do at home. So usually what I suggest is, to start, I would suggest looking up the unhelpful thinking styles and becoming really familiar with them, so that you can start labeling it in your own head, right? You have to start paying attention to what you're thinking. So if you feel yourself starting to get angry or anxious or any kind of negative emotion, you want to stop and ask yourself, what am I thinking about? And then you can label it if it is any of those unhelpful thinking styles. And to me, that's the first step, because you want to take a little bit of the power away from your thoughts, right? If you don't question them, then they are accurate and true and believable. But if you start labeling them as unhelpful thinking styles, like, oh, I'm definitely mind reading right now, I'm really overgeneralizing what's going on. All of a sudden, you've already removed a little bit of that thought's power, because you're questioning it and you're externalizing it a little bit, right? It's not entirely in your head. It's not you. It's not 100% true. Now it's something you're looking at with a little bit of distance, so it won't impact you quite as much. And then we would do something called a thought record. So you write down what the thought is, the emotions that it triggers in you, and then you look for the evidence. And you want to look for both evidence that proves that the thought is true, as well as evidence that proves that the thought is not true. And it needs to be evidence, not opinion, right? So just because you think it's true, that doesn't count as evidence. It has to be someone has said something, or you've seen something with your own eyes, something that is a fact. And then you look at both the sides that are proving it's true, the side that is proving it's not true, and you try and think of a more accurate version of that thought, because we're not trying to ignore the negative, right? We're not trying to make things all puppies and rainbows and just super positive. What we want is to take you away from being super skewed towards the negative and only focusing on that, and bring you down into being realistic, being able to see things for what it is, so that you can plan accurately and move forward and cope well. So you're not just stuck ruminating or thinking a lot about all of these negative things. Instead, you're accurately looking at a situation and dealing with it. So we would do a thought record, so that you can really get an accurate idea of what's going on and how true your thinking is.
Yeah, I love the concept as it's just separating fact from fiction.
Mm-hmm.
You said the words positive thinking quite a lot already. And I know, and I definitely, in the past, when I first started reading self-help books, this was something I probably fell into the trap of, which is just thinking that, if you just think positively, everything will be okay. But obviously there has to be, a genuine connection between the way you feel and the way you think, for this to actually have any merit. Like, talk us through the concept of positive thinking and why positive thinking just alone is actually maybe not the best way to go about life.
Well, I mean, of course, positive thinking is important, right? We don't want you stuck in just thinking negatively all the time. And I think the problem is that, like you said, people think that if they just ignore the negative and just think positively, that's enough, that's going to make them feel better. But ignoring the negative doesn't make it go away, right? Part of, I think, coping is learning to accept and address whatever is negative, as opposed to trying to ignore it. I like to think about my role as not necessarily trying to make you, super positive and happy. I want you to be realistic. I want you to be able to cope with everything that life brings on. We're not going to ignore the negative. We are going to address the negative, and we're going to learn to cope with it in a healthy way so that you can move forward. Because sometimes part of the problem in our thinking is that we ruminate, we get stuck on negative thoughts, and they repeat and they repeat and they repeat, and we never follow them through, right? So we never go past that thought of, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail. It just repeats. It makes us feel awful. And we never stop and actually say, okay, I'm worried that I'm going to fail. What am I going to do about it? A lot of the time we don't follow the thought through to the end, which can involve a few different things, right? It can involve thinking about worst case scenario, right? You want to follow it through. What is the worst case scenario, and how accurate is it? Are you going to die? Is something really terrible going to happen? Or is it actually not going to be that bad? Because being stuck in the I'm going to fail doesn't let you realize that maybe the end result of failing isn't actually that bad, right? Maybe it won't be as terrible as you think it is. Or also, okay, if you do fail, then what? What are you going to do? So part of what can make us feel better is actually having a plan should the worst case scenario happen, feeling competent and able to handle something negative, because life isn't all positive, right? It isn't puppies and rainbows, like we were saying. Bad things do happen. And it's about knowing how to cope, being resilient, being able to handle what life throws at you in a healthy way that doesn't lead you down a really dark path.
It just made me think about listening to Michael Phelps on a podcast where he was talking about, they used to do a lot of visualization, and they would visualize best case scenario, which would be, the dominant thought in training, but they also did visualizations of worst case scenario. And like you said, they would actually practice the worst case scenario happening. So there'd be times where, he would deliberately put the goggles loose, so when he dived in the pool, the goggles would be ripped off his head and he'd still have to swim. And I think he actually won a gold in Beijing with his goggles not on his head. And then he talked about it after, being like, well, I'd practiced that worst case scenario, so I knew it wasn't gonna be that bad. Whereas a person maybe who hadn't practiced it would probably have a massive panic, being like, this is the Olympics and my goggles are just falling off, what am I supposed to do? But I never really thought about it as actually something that we can be doing in everyday life when we do our fact checking, to say, actually lean into the worst case scenario and actually how bad it would actually be. I think when I hear you talk about that, I think about myself a lot in my early years, which, I was definitely, raised by two very strong-minded parents who were strong and hardworking business people. And for whatever reason, in my teens, I would deal with problems just by sweeping them under the rug, and just by, you know, thinking that, you know, working harder and doing more would just be okay. And so what would actually end up happening is that the issues would never get addressed. And then probably periodically every 3 to 6 months, they'd come out in a spectacular way, which is pretty ugly. And then I would just deal with it and just move on and never actually address them. I mean, is that something you see quite often and commonly?
Yep, definitely a lot. I think there's a lot of people in the world that's how they cope, or they learn to cope as they grow up, is you just sweep it under the rug, keep doing that until it grows so large that you can't ignore it anymore. And then you kind of have this big outburst and you have to cope. And then you just go right back to that same cycle over and over again. I actually have a lot of people who come and see me specifically because they want to stop that cycle, because they're sick of feeling like they can't deal with their problems as they come, that they are stuck in this way of just, trying to hide it, trying to push it away, push it down as far as possible until it's too much. And then they only cope in some big, outburst type of way, oftentimes to the detriment of the people that really love them. I find that people who do push things down will sometimes explode on those that they're closest to. And that tends to be part of the reason why people will choose to come and see me to try and change it.
Yeah. Kat, talk to me about circles of control. I'm not sure, because this is an area that is of interest to you. I'm not sure if what we're talking about now is leading into the concept of circles of control, but what is the concept of circle control? And, you know, what are some examples of the things that you see with the people you work with?
So I love circles of control because I find that a lot of people, when things are going wrong in their life, we live in a perpetual state of, if this would change, or if that person would do something differently, or if my partner just wouldn't do that one thing, I would be happy. We would be happy. Everything would be great. The problem there is that we tend to point, at other people, that the things that we want them to change so that we can be happy. But we have absolutely no control over other people. We have no ability to change the things that they do or what they say or how they handle life. The only thing that we have control over is ourselves. So we look at the circles of control. We look at, okay, what do I have control over? What do I not have control over? And pretty much what it comes down to is I can control my thoughts, not necessarily feelings. I can influence my feelings, but my reactions, my behaviors, things along those lines, anything to do with myself. And I cannot control anything to do with other people, their thoughts, their behaviors, their feelings, their responses, their reactions, etc. So when an issue arises, for example, in a relationship, right? You're in a relationship with someone and the way that they respond to something, you and your partner continue to get into the same types of arguments over and over again. It's a cycle, and you think to yourself, if they would just change one aspect of how they respond, everything would be better. But of course, you can ask them to, there's no problem there. You can, of course, try and get them to change that thing, but you can't control that. It has to come from them. So if you want to see change in those types of cycles, you have to look at what you're doing and change something about how you are responding, because that is something that you actually can control. And what you'll find is, if there are these types of cycles, for example, in communication or in anything in your life where you want something to change and you change an aspect of how you're responding, it will influence the rest of the cycle. It will influence how other people respond to you as well. And you will see change in that situation. And definitely you can see more change than if you are trying to wait for someone else to change their part.
I love this. So, I mean, it's so funny because everything you're talking about, I just think about myself and I'm like, that was obviously me at some certain point. And I have very specific memories of times in my life where these things applied. I've talked about this a lot on the podcast. Our listeners will be familiar with this, but I read a book by Jocko Willink called Taking Ownership. And the whole concept of that, he was an SAS commander, and whatever happened to anything around him and his team, it was all on him. He would take ownership of everything that happened. And it just resonated with me a lot. And so I'd realized that there were areas of my life where I was shifting responsibility and, exactly like you just talked about, wasn't really taking ownership and understanding what was in my control, what was out of my control. And when I started radically changing my life to think about taking control of everything, it also got a little overwhelming because I realized that there was so much work that I had to do. And there was so many areas, and I realized how much influence I actually had. So it kind of went both ways. In some ways, it was really therapeutic knowing that actually a lot of things I can control and it's within my control. But at the other end, it was overwhelming because holy shit, there's so much now that falls on my shoulders that I need to do a better job at. And that's when the work all started. What are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there's also some importance in middle ground there, right? Because this idea of, that book that you read and this person taking control of what happened to everyone, that's too far the other way, in my opinion, right? Because so, for example, with those unhelpful thinking styles, one of those unhelpful thinking styles is called personalization. And that's blaming yourself for taking responsibility for something that isn't completely your fault. So you also have to find that middle ground where what is in your control, but what is also influenced by other people. I can control my actions, but I can't control other people's responses. So therefore, if what they are doing does still impact things, I can still acknowledge that, right? I don't want to shift my own responsibility or my own blame, and I want to take control of what I can. But I also have to realize that that still involves understanding that other people are still going to be other people, and they're still going to have their own versions of what they think is right. And I can't control that. And if something goes wrong that involves me and another person, I will take my portion, but I can leave them theirs as well.
Yeah, I think I definitely took a very radical approach to it. And probably I remember just trying to, basically go down the chain of events and work out, try and somehow find a way for it to link back to me so that I could find something to take ownership of. But you're right, it was probably a little bit too aggressive. I actually ended up probably burdening myself more so than I needed to. Anything else on circles of control, Kat?
I would just say, I think it's important for everyone to just start looking at what makes them unhappy and how much of what makes them unhappy are they putting on others. How much are they saying, if this person would just do that, I would be happy. Start realizing that that's not something that's in your control, and that's not something that you can make change. So what can you change? We as people feel a lot better, a lot less anxious, a lot less depressed, a lot happier when we start looking at things that we actually have control over, because then we can do something about it. When we're looking at other people, there's a sense of helplessness because you can't change it, and that makes things worse. So, do what you can when it comes to your own stuff, and don't try and don't try and change other people.
I feel like that's so prevalent right now. I mean, especially here in Hong Kong with, everything that's happening around COVID, there's a lot of, you hear that same language around a lot, which is, a blaming and I guess just like, almost chronic whining without the actual objective of trying to find a solution. Yeah. But I mean, and then I spoke to you.
Still okay, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
there is room for whining.
Okay, actually, so tell me about the concept of whining, because I know there are some people who are very much believers that, like, there is no return on investment in whining. You need to, if you're going to whine, you need to find a solution. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that it's just one of those things where we can be unhappy about something that we can't change. You're allowed to voice unhappiness. Just because it isn't something you control or you can't change doesn't mean that it can't still make you unhappy. But it's about understanding that it's going to make you unhappy, but you can't force change on it. So you can be unhappy and you can be upset about something that you can't control, but there is a point where you have to sort of move forward and move past it, right? You don't want to get stuck in it. I think that's where the problem lies. I think it also makes, especially when something is such as what's happening in Hong Kong, where you really have no control, there's nothing you can do. There is something to be said about sharing that with other people and feeling like you're not alone in it. So there's a sense of feeling better in feeling as though other people are feeling the same way you are. But again, at the same time, there's middle ground. You don't want to go too far. You don't want to just spend all of your time thinking about that and whining and ruminating on it and feeling as though it's making you more and more depressed. But it's okay to do a bit of complaining and whining and, find other people feel the same so you don't feel so alone.
Yeah, maybe it comes back to what we talked about earlier, actually getting it off your chest and saying it out loud is a better method than just sweeping it under the rug and not addressing it.
100%.
Talk to me about acceptance and commitment therapy, please, Kat.
Okay. So another type of therapy, right? This one it's a bit more, I guess, action oriented, right? It's based on learning to stop avoiding or denying or struggling with your emotions. I think a lot of people try to push, like you were saying, push things away, maybe pretend they're not happening, blame other people, et cetera, trying to do everything in their power to avoid negative feelings, to try and make themselves feel happy, even if maybe what's going on is really difficult. So acceptance and commitment therapy to some extent is about accepting these feelings and accepting that maybe they're an appropriate response to whatever's happening in your life right now. And maybe you trying to push them away is actually stopping you from moving forward in your life because you're not coping, you're not learning to deal with that emotion because maybe you're trying to push it away too much. So, it's about accepting what's happening, understanding how you're feeling about it, and then learning to deal. I really like it because I think it's a good sort of combo with cognitive behavioral therapy where you are learning to understand what you're thinking about and what you're doing and how that influences your feelings. And then you have acceptance and commitment where to some extent it's about learning not to keep avoiding or denying what it is that you're feeling and actually accept it as your body and your mind is responding to a difficult situation, and that's okay.
I feel, when I listen to all of this, it seems so simple, which is like, why don't we just listen to our thoughts and why don't we recognize our thoughts and act appropriately? Why are human beings? Why are we so generally so bad at this?
Well,
you got any theories?
You have to think about it. It's in your head, right? Of course you're going to believe it. It's like you think it's you. You know what I mean? It's very hard to assume that you are wrong, right? Or that what's going on in your head is incorrect. It takes practice. We don't naturally do that. You know what I mean? We talk to ourselves constantly, all day, every day. So you actually have to make an effort to start changing that and start thinking about it differently. I think a lot of people, once they start hearing about this kind of stuff, they start doing it themselves and they don't necessarily need to go to therapy. You just have to sort of be triggered to start thinking, okay, let me actually start looking at what I'm thinking and seeing how that influences me. But I don't think it's something that comes naturally because it's in our head. And so, of course, we're going to believe it.
Yeah. Roles of people in your life. I feel like when you told me about this concept, it was something that I had just gone through very recently and kind of come to this epiphany, or at least started to think about things a bit differently. Tell me about the concept of roles of people in your life and why it's important to have different categories of different people.
So this is something I think I see a lot of, especially in Hong Kong, I've found, probably because of, I don't know, just the types of people, but also the fact that there's a lot of people who come and go all the time. So there's a lot of room for being hurt, for losing people you care about, for, meeting people who aren't necessarily committed to being in Hong Kong or are transient, and therefore they aren't there to, make deep connections, et cetera, et cetera. So you have people who treat every individual that they meet the same. So everyone is a close friend or everyone is a potential partner, for example, because they just don't categorize people as being different. And then you see that those people tend to get hurt a lot because they invest the same amount of time and effort into every single person that they meet. Whereas what you should be doing, in my opinion, at least, is understanding that different people are going to serve different purposes in your life and have different roles. So you'll have friends, but they're not all going to be close friends. And that's okay, right? Not everyone is meant to be your close friend. You can have work friends. You can have friends that you just go out and party with. I mean, whenever that's possible. You can have friends that you just go for coffee with, or you just hike with, or whatever else. And so you cannot expect the same level of commitment from them towards you, because they probably don't see you as a close friend. You know what I mean? And that's okay. So you just have to realize that different people have you can put them in different categories in your life in order to serve different purposes. So therefore you have different expectations for them. And what that does is it saves you a lot of heartache and a lot of disappointment and being hurt when those people don't all end up living up to whatever expectation you have of those that are closest to you.
This is basically turning into Ed's therapy session, by the way. If you whack me with a bill, you just send it to my email. So I think when when previously, growing up in my teens and early 20s, I think I'd very much had I didn't really think about any of that stuff at all. It was just, make connections, and some connections feel stronger than others. And those seem to be the people that become friends. And when I started going down my own journey of, self-help and thinking about a lot of this stuff and reading books and finding out a different way of being and challenging a lot of my beliefs, I then found myself feeling like I was craving connection. And so, I remember at a certain point in time where all I wanted was deep conversations. I wanted to avoid the superficial. And I think I then told myself that actually all I want from someone is someone who's on a similar journey to myself, who has those deep connections. And obviously, looking back now, I didn't really recognize that we're all just on different parts of our journey, and that no one was with me at that point in time. And I was kind of a lone ranger, searching and understanding the stuff myself. And I think, where I've come around to this now is understanding that concept that, not every person is at the same point in their journey. Some people may never be on that same point in their journey. And it's important for me to have those other friends that provide me with different things, because I also realized that I can't just be deep thinking and having deep conversations all the time, because that's draining and it's exhausting on me and probably the other person. So when he talked about this concept of, the need for different categories and different roles in your life, it was a real kind of awakening thing for me.
100%. And I think that it's hard sometimes to make that realization, because like you said, we really do want to connect with people. We want those deep connections. And I think especially if you're at a point in your life where maybe you don't have those connections with the people that are around you, which is okay. We all will have those dips in our lives where those closest to us maybe moved away, or we moved away, and we don't have those strong connections. And so we search for them. And I think that's where we might become, most susceptible to this type of hurt, where we try and make those connections with people that obviously shouldn't be filling that role in our lives. And so I think sometimes it's about realizing that those people might just not be in your life right now. And you have to accept people for who they are and for whatever role they do fill in your life, and be glad that you have them, and give it time, because you will meet other people, and you will meet people who do fill those roles eventually, but you can't force it, and I think sometimes we try to force it.
Well, so talk to me about the concept of people pleasing then. Because I feel like the journey before searching and craving deep connections, I feel like I very much was a people pleaser. Wanted to create some form of connection with absolutely everyone, but lacked anything kind of beyond surface level stuff. Where does that come from? Where does that originate?
Well, I mean, I think that what you're describing is something that everyone goes through, right? We grow up, we go through our teen years where, our peers are incredibly important, as well as in your 20s. Our friends become the most important people in our lives. And that serves a really important purpose, right? If when you're transitioning from being a child into an adult, when you're a kid, your family is the most important in your life. Those people are the people you want to spend most of your time with. And in order to become an independent person, you have to move away from that, right? You have to learn to prioritize other people so that you can meet a partner, have your own family, move away from the family home, etc. And so when you're a teenager, it's one of the purposes or functions of teenagers feeling the need to constantly be with friends and make those connections, is so that you can become an independent adult. It's very necessary. It is difficult, though. Obviously, it's a difficult place to be, because then in prioritizing other people so heavily, we feel very judged a lot of the time. We feel like we can't make mistakes. We worry about how other people are seeing us, and it can have some pretty big detrimental effects on our self-esteem. So I feel like once you hit the 20s and then the later 20s, you start to move away from that, become a little bit more comfortable with yourself, and you're able to start prioritizing yourself a bit more rather than other people. So that's the point usually where you can start making closer, sort of real, long-term connections, because you're making connections based on what you really want and not just what you think other people want as well. Where, when you're a teenager, you're quite concerned with how other people think of you, and how your friends see you.
Quite reassuring to hear that it's a natural part of the process, because I definitely felt for some time that, almost beat myself up for living that way for so long. You talked about, teens there quite a bit, and you make me think about like childhood. And, I've seemed to keep seeing more and more ideas around the concept of, the way that we were raised as children, and sometimes, even very early infancy into, before 10 years old and then beyond, how that can have such a marked effect on how we grow up and develop as adults. What are your thoughts, or what are some of the ideas around that?
Well, I mean, there's two sides to that. 100% what happens to you as a kid is going to impact how you are as an adult, right? You learn, especially when it comes to your family unit. There's a reason why, when we have this idea that therapy is all about you laying down and talking about your mother, right? Because it really does matter. The relationships that you have with your parents and your family, it create a blueprint of what you're going to do. You create these scripts in your head when you're a kid of how you see relationships, how you see people interacting, right? The way that your parents interact creates a script in your head of what a relationship is like, what a marriage is like. How do two people respond to one another? A lot of the time you'll see kids who, they go to school and they'll hit other kids or be aggressive. And so one of the questions we always ask is, well, what are they seeing at home? Because kids mimic, right? They learn through watching and observing and mimicking, and they learn to cope and deal with problems in whatever way they've been encouraged to, or however they've seen their family unit do so. Of course, not entirely, it's not 100%, but it has a big impact. So what happens to you as a kid is very much going to influence who you become as an adult. And so it is one of the reasons why we do talk about that a lot in therapy, not because we want to dredge up terrible things that happen to you, but so that we can understand where your current behavior maybe started from. And so that we can then address that and put in some new coping skills or new ways of addressing these situations. You can't change something that you don't understand. Right. So if you don't understand what your triggers are, if you have anger and you don't know what's triggering your anger, then it's very hard to change it. Right. You've got to figure out what's happening and understand what's happening before you can start to change what's happening.
And like how early do we as small little human beings start becoming aware of our environment, and the environment actually starts having a lasting impact on us?
Oh, well, I mean, pre-birth, right? In utero, what happens to your mom, levels of stress, things like that can impact your nervous system. So you may not have memories, right? You may not have started to form memories yet, but when you're an infant, it can still impact your nervous system and impact the way that you process emotions and et cetera. You have infants who have terrible things happen to them. And you got learned helplessness where you'll stop crying and responding to what's happening in their environment, and that continues on as they get older. They may not as an adult have memories of this happening, but it doesn't take away the fact that there is a long-lasting impact on their nervous system, on themselves, on how they cope, and how they learn to respond. It's obviously part of response in terms of anxiety inducing situations or difficult situations comes from your brain, right? It's not like you are choosing your response. It's something that can be triggered. So for example, like fight or flight, right? You don't have control over that. But if your body senses or your brain senses that something is dangerous, it's going to trigger fight or flight, whether you want it to or not. So those types of things happening to you very young can leave an imprint on your body and your brain, and influence how it then continues to respond to difficult situations as you get older. On top of learning how to cope and whether you learn to regulate. That's one thing I think that's being discussed quite heavily right now, is that kids learn to regulate their emotions based on how they're taught to regulate their emotions, right? If they're yelled at for crying constantly, or punished for being upset, they don't learn to actually deal with being upset. They learn to stop being upset, or at least not look upset, right? So it depends on what your parents teach you or how they teach you to cope.
Yeah, I've only recently started doing some digging into thinking about, the way that perhaps, I was raised as a child has had an impact on who I ended up being as an adult, or at least for some part of my life. And actually, have started to piece together lots of things that started to make sense. And it was actually really cool to kind of to be able to attribute some of the ways that I was, maybe the sides that perhaps I wasn't so happy with, but also the sides I was really happy with, to specific things that might have happened in the way that I was raised, or the relationship between my parents. I have also spoken to other people about it as well. And I do know that certainly some people fall into holding a grudge, or creating a new set of feelings against like the parenting styles used on them. And I think, so often our parents are doing everything they can within what they know at that point in time. And we've just reflected on it differently. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people do. And to some extent, of course, if we're talking about things like abuse, then I think that you have the right. But like you said, if it's just, parents, and myself as a new parent with a 10-month-old, I feel like you are always just doing the best that you can, and you're never going to get it 100% right. No one can. And so we also have to have a little bit of, understanding that our parents probably just did whatever they were either told. I mean, even if you look at theories of parenting, throughout history, like there is stuff that now we've changed and we don't agree with anymore, but at a certain point in time it was thought to be the best. There also is very little consensus on what is actually right or wrong when it comes to parenting, so it's very difficult to look back on it now. It's a case of hindsight bias in a way, right? Yeah. It's very unfair to look at the past with our current knowledge and judge past decisions when we know what the end result was. Because at the time when we make that decision, we don't know what's going to happen. So we make the best decision we can with whatever information we have at that time. And so this applies to our parents, but also applies to whatever we've done in the past. If you have those things where you look back and you go, God, why did I do that? Why did I make that decision? That you cannot hold a grudge against yourself for decisions that you made, because you're judging your past decisions with new knowledge that you didn't have at that time. And that is completely unfair. Yeah,
love that. Kat, the thing I want to finish off with here, and I've really, really enjoyed the conversation and would love for it to go for another 10 hours. But so, we talked a lot about different options we have within therapy. Now, how about just general pieces of advice for people who perhaps are not ready or at the stage where therapy is an option? What are some simple things that, like, as human beings, we could be doing to maybe create more self-awareness and start to have more understanding around everything you've been talking about today?
Well, I always tell my clients that first you have the baseline, right? You have to be eating well, exercising, sleeping well. Those are the most important things, because you can't start changing anything if you're not covering your baseline, bases. So that's definitely first. And then I would say the very first thing is to just start trying to understand what is happening and why, right? Again, you can't start changing things until you have an understanding. So if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling depressed, if you feel like you have anger, whenever it happens, stop and ask yourself, what am I doing and what am I thinking? feel free to write it down, right? One thing that happens in the homework that I tend to give people is I always tell people to write things down, and not even in your phone, do it with your hand, because there's something to be said about handwriting things. It gives you a chance to really think about what you're doing and what you're thinking. Because if you're just keeping things in your mind and just thinking about them, there is a limit to how many pieces of information you can keep in your brain at one time. If you write things down, you can see a much bigger picture, right? Because you can look at all of the information you've written down at one time. So write down what you're thinking, write down what you're feeling, keep track of your moods. And so you can start to see patterns, you can start to see triggers, and you can start to understand yourself a little bit better. And once you have that understanding, then you can start asking yourself, are my thoughts true? Are they accurate? What's going on? And then the other thing I would say is, if nothing else, spend a little bit of time at the end of the day, thinking about the actual good things in your life as well. We're quite skewed towards the negative, and we tend to focus so heavily on what's wrong in our world, in our lives, that we forget to acknowledge the good things as well. So I always think it's a good idea to end your day by thinking about the things in your life that you're grateful for and that are actually going well. So you don't, spend your whole day just focusing on the negative. And then, outside of that, I would say continue listening to podcasts about wellness, as your listeners are doing right now, because you can learn a lot. There's tons of really good information online. Start Googling. There's a lot that you can access without having to actually seek help from a professional. Or if nothing else, go for one session with someone and just ask them to say, I'm just here for one. I just want some tips on what I can do to cope with this. I don't want to dive deep into my past. I just want a few tips on how to handle my anxiety. And they'll be able to do that. You don't have to go for therapy for 3 years. You can do a one-off and just get some help in that moment as well.
Amazing. Kat, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Now, before we end this, we'd just love for you to provide us with some information as to how people can find more about you, and if people would love to work with you or like to work with you, perhaps how they can contact you.
Sure. So as you said, I work at the Jadis Blurton Family Development Center. We're located in LKF.
That's Lang Kwai Fong for international
Lang
listeners.
Kwai Fong. You can either Google our website, so Jadis Blurton, JADISBLURTON. You can Google me, so Katrina Rozga, and you'll find me there. Or you can email me directly. So my email address is krozga, KROZGA, at Blurton, BLURTON -FDC.com. So Blurton Family Development Center. Do you
do sessions online remotely, Kat?
Yep. At the moment, I am fully online. And then hopefully when things die down, we can come back to being in person again.
Awesome. Kat, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. Good luck with your new 10-month-old, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Thanks for having me.